Hello? Is that working?
Okay, so
I am continuing my comments on secular liturgies, time, drugs, and instrumental reasoning. Today I'm going to do part 2 of time. Until about the middle of the 1500s, the calendar was really messed up. Things were really consistent out of sync, so the calendar clearly needed to be reformed. And speaking of reformations, the Council of Trent, they're connected. The Counter-Reformation, the Council of Trent. The Catholic Church was, in response to Martin Luther and Calvin et al., clearly realized they were full of problems beyond the things that Luther was stirring up. And they sought to reform the church. Among the things they were trying to fix was the church mass. They thought it had to become better. They were, in a sense, facing market competition. And they thought clearly they didn't want to admit it, but Luther's critiques were somewhat right on some regard. So the Council of Trent did many things. Among them, they wanted mass to become better, bring the crowds in. So thus we have an increase of better music, better art. Mass became more theatrical. This is the rise of Baroque art, which was much more ornamental and colorful and beautiful. Again, that's part of the Counter-Reformation, bring people into the church. In some sense, church became more fun, or had to get more fun. But then the question arose, when do they actually go to church? What day was it? Was it Easter, Lent, Christmas? What day should we do these things? And in terms of salvation, what you did in church depended on what day it was and what you're doing in church and when you go to church. And no one at this time, shockingly, it's fascinating to think about, knew exactly what day it was at the time. For example, Easter falls on the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the beginning of the spring equinox, which depended on the moon-sun cycle that could not be checked correctly except for every 312.5 years. And the last time they could have checked this, the moon didn't come up. And the calendar they were clearly using was 9 days out. And that was a problem. So I mean, we just take time for granted that it's just given, we all know. I want to imagine a world in the middle of the 1500s where, depending on what part of Italy, what part of Germany, what part of England, they're all completely out of sync. And how do you solve this problem? You have a council of debate and argue with one another. No one really knew. And the more it goes on, the more out of whack it becomes. No one knew what day it was all over Christendom. And yet, it's not a casual issue. It's a matter of when you go to church, what you do in church, which is a matter of spiritual salvation for you, society, and all of Christendom. And this is also part of the Counter-Reformation as well. Now, the church authority is contingent on being right. And church authority was the very thing that Luther was attacking. The church held society together, spiritually and bureaucratically. Everyone from princes and castles on down to the local peasant. It depended on the faithful doing what they were supposed to do at the right time, liturgy and worship. So the Pope wanted the sun and the moon and the calendar checked out better than they had been for some time. That led to 1512, a priest named Nicholas Copernicus, whose name you probably already heard of, took a close look at the stars and regulated the calendar. I always talk about Nicholas Copernicus in my classes at the beginning of the scientific revolution, the displacement of the Earth from the middle of the world to the sun, that would start the ball rolling with Johannes Kepler, Isaac Newton, and so on and so forth. The beginning of the scientific revolution, yet actually the initial motivation was, how do we fix a church calendar? It takes a much closer, precise look. Now, the way he fixed the church calendar was, he had to figure out why do things move the way they move. And the old argument was called epicycles, where if the Earth is in the middle and the sun is I always get confused. The old version, Earth in the middle and everything orbits around the sun. Well, the problem is you have these stars like Mars and Venus who don't behave properly. They don't go around. If you just look in the sky, the stars, they do these loop-the-loops. They go forward, they come back, and go forward again, and it looks really strange. So you have to create these models of epicycles where we have circles, crystallized spheres, with the planets embedded in them, moving around. The way to explain Mars and Venus is you have a circle in a circle. Remember those spiral graphs you used to play with? They used to love those, a circle. Yeah, they thought, well, maybe it's got to be a mechanism where God made a circle in the circle. So Mars and Venus are moving around, loop to loop to looping in a little wheel. Not a metaphorical wheel, a literal wheel. Well, the only way to make this cosmos work was you have to have 90 epicycles. Epicycles within epicycles. And Copernicus thought, this is just really, really messed up. Why would God make such a wacky, stupid universe? Which is why he thought, you want to really simplify this? If we move the Earth from the middle to a third planet, and put the sun in the middle, And then you just have a really simple system. Well, it did two things. It fixed the calendar, but really, well, all hell broke loose. Made Perry very upset because the church authority, except now church authority was problematized by the fixing of the calendar. You can either have a good calendar church authority, you can't have both apparently. Well, you can, but at this time, it got people very upset. Okay, well, anyway, this starts the ball rolling on Nicholas Copernicus to Johannes Kepler to Newton, Galileo to Newton. To make a long story short, the world went from being regulated by the hand of God, by his sovereignty, to a regular machine. So the older model would have been something like this. The sun rises because God takes his mighty God hand, grabs a big fiery ball, and moves it across the sky every day. You know, kind of like every morning I have to churn butter. Every morning I have to milk the cow. Every morning God's like, here we go again, moving a big fiery ball across just for you. And thus that has other implications until the time of revolution. You know, if you lose a really good rainfall, you say, thank you, God, I appreciate that. And if there's a drought, you have to wonder, well, what sin did I commit? Why is God literally withholding the rain from me until I can repent? With the advent of the scientific revolution, kind of beyond Copernicus, we have a model where the universe is not by fiat, God making things happen because he wants to on that day, but rather the world is working through what you might call a machine. They have this idea called Descartes calls it a mechanical universe. The D is called a clockwork universe, or clockwork God, or God is a divine clockmaker. Now, the analogy of the cosmos being a clock or machine was contingent on the existence of mechanical clocks. And that takes us backwards to the invention and the proliferation of mechanical clocks. That's to say, you can't say God's like a clockmaker unless you got clocks in the first place. And it so happens clocks were invented shortly before this. So last time I discussed the history of the calendar time, how to measure time on the Sazis, how do you figure out what time of the year it is, how to measure a year, season of the year that came and went. And so today I want to shift to the times of the day, what we call the 24-hour day cycle. And that itself has a strange history. By the way, it occurred to me, this is like a long prologue to a point I want to get to the end. I should have said this earlier on. One thing that history does is shows us an alien, it shows us an alien world. But the process of looking at an alien world, we realize our own world is alien. We have to alienate ourselves from our own time to realize to what extent we are contingent beings and things don't have to be this way. And there are some hidden snags in the world in which we live in. So that's a long lead up to a point I want to make. Right? This sounds I think it's rather interesting, but it could be tedious. But I do have a point I'm trying to get to at the end. So last time we talked about the history of calendar time, which I just did, how to measure year. And so how do we get to this 24-hour cycle? How do we measure the hours of the day? Well, the earliest clock to measure the times of day we have found in ancient Egypt. It was, as you imagine, a sundial. Now, the earliest clock we found is basically like a stick sticking out of a stone circle, as you can imagine, a sundial. And I wish I had a picture of it, but it's basically imagine like it's like half of a pie, little wedges sticking out. A stick in a stone with lines radiating from the stick. An obelisk, those big things that we have in Washington, D.C., that was also theorized to also be just a massive sundial. That's why they make these tall little stone sticks coming out of nowhere for no reason. And you all know what a sundial is. I won't get to how that works. You generally have a sense. But what's really interesting about this ancient sundial, the earliest sundial I found in Egypt, was that it was divided into 12 equal chunks of time, so 12 wedges. Why? Well, because each wedge was 1 hour in the daylight, and they also had 12 hours in the day and 12 hours at night. Now, we know how you measure 12 hours in a day. Well, how do they measure 12 hours at night? Well, they didn't actually very well. They have it from stars to see the rise at night. So they would use the rising stars to measure the hours of the night. But they also had things like water clocks, where water would pour out of one little vessel into another. And as it filled up, they could realize, well, that's 1 hour of the evening time. So roughly speaking, they had 12 hours in the morning and 12 hours at night, which raises the question, why 12? Now, when I was in grade school, I always wondered about this. I really struggled with clocks. I love my digital watch, whatever you learn time, but the whole time thing really confused me for a lot of reasons. I was just bad at it. I figured it out later on. But the big question for me was, why 12? Why 12 hours in a day? And then why 60 minutes an hour? And why 60 seconds? If we're up to me, we should just have metric time. I think we should have 10 hours a day, 10 hours a night. You know, then 10 minutes in an hour and 10 seconds. We should have like metric time. We should have like what do you call cent to hour, milli-hour, you know, or deci hour. It seems rather bizarre, doesn't it? Everyone wonder why that's the case. Well, apparently this is why. Why 12 hours a day? Well, here's a theory, which is probably right. The Egyptians had a base 12 number system. You know, we have a base 10, they had a base 12. Well, why base 12? Well, apparently one theory is they counted the chunks of the segments of your fingers. You know, 1, 2, 3, the big meaty parts, and they count their thumbs. So do it with me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Fascinating, isn't it? And when paper was rare, or papyrus was rare, you know, clay, it's hard to write things down. Well, you can count your hands. Your thumbs are a counter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So everything's a base 12. Well, why 60? They also had a base 60 number system, which they got from the Sumerians and the Babylonians. Well, follow with me. You have a base 12, right? Then that's what we count on your left hand. On your right hand, each finger is 12. 12, 12, 12, 12, 12. So you count by 12s, okay? 12 times 5 is 60. Base 12, base 60. That's why we have 12 rounds in a day, at 60 minutes an hour, and 60 seconds in an hour. We really ought to go to metric time. Yeah, I'm not a Babylonian, I'm not an Egyptian. Why are we doing this nonsense? I want a deci hour, a milli-hour, a centi hour. Anyway. The time that the Egyptians, ancient people, did you understand that? Isn't that kind of fascinating?
Yeah.
Yeah, 60, 12 and 60 here. Doesn't help me with my watch, but anyway, time, maybe we should teach that to kids. It would make them a lot less frustrated.
Just to clarify, you're saying 12, just these four.
Yeah, because you use your thumb to count.
Not using.
Yeah, the thumb.
So it's like a sensation.
I think so. Maybe, yeah, you're right.
Sort of like sensory a little bit.
Because, you know, remember, they don't have things to write. They can't write things down on paper.
Yeah.
So the memory would be.
Go 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
You know, sign language does numbers.
Yeah.
So, you know, 8, 9, 7, 8, 9, it's where it's position of the hand.
I mean, that's a really good one. Like, how many jokes in one is like bumbo me? Well, you know, I kind of remember.
Yeah.
Because you couldn't write it down, it would be really, really hard, very expensive.
Because you can just touch what digit, so this is 11. Or 10, 11, 12.
Oh, they have a sign.
Yeah, if the assigned position on the finger.
Because I know that when my kids were going to this slightly interesting school, they memorized by singing songs.
Yeah.
And they have body motions and a lot of, and I started doing it with them. I thought, yeah, I'm kind of into this. I mean, I can really see how you can learn things by feeling it in your body.
Right.
Yeah.
But we learned from the Sumerians based on recordings that they made in clay tablets.
Yeah.
Not on papyrus.
Yes.
That's how we deduced the base 60.
Yeah. I mean, there was papyrus, but that's all gone. So we only have what we have.
Right.
Yeah.
That's why 360 degrees in a circle.
Yes, exactly.
Does Judeo-Christian sacred numerology come into this at all? With the sacredness of 3 and 4?
No, it is interesting, isn't it? I don't have the answer to that. That thought did occur to me. The 12 disciples, the Trinity, 3 of the digits. There might be something there.
12 tribes.
12 tribes, yeah. 12 threes are and 7. That's your
7 is 3 plus 4. It's enough, and it's divinely inspired.
60 is also a highly divisible number as well. It's very convenient that way. Lots of numbers go into 60.
I'll say the first supercomputer was a 60-bit byte, 6-bit words.
Why not? Yeah,
CDC computers back in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, some numbers are just convenient and easier. So there might be something intuitive. I heard another reason that's why like 13 is an unlucky number. 12 is good, 13 now is just messed up. I mean, I don't know what's going beyond that. I heard another theory that we could count 10 fingers and 2 feet. So 10, 11, 12, left foot, right foot, then beyond that.
I like the first one better.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. It's rather elegant, actually, if you think about it, but that's why we have 12 hours a day and 24 hours, you know, the daytime, 24 hours.
Go ahead.
Good. How did the English world come up with the stupid
system of counting, like foot, 12 inches for foot, etc. But the rest of the world is all metric.
English are stubborn. I mean, the original idea was when you measure a horse, for example, they still do this. If you measure a horse, you have hands,
Right.
literal hands.
And when you measure fabric, you talk about yards, which was the length of the king's arm.
That's right.
Well, meters came about because of the French Revolution.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes.
Well, the French Revolution,
There was a scientific.
there was one of the big complaints of lots of people in France at the time was, every area had different weights and measures.
Mhm.
And so you could get cheated very easily if you were a farmer or somebody. And so they decided, once the king was gone, that they were gonna come up with a new system. So that's where that.
Standardized.
The French Revolution was born out of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment was born out of the scientific revolution.
Right.
In fact, in the French Revolution, they also went to reform the count as well. I think they had like year one.
Yeah, they started, that didn't keep.
No, but again, that was a contradiction to Anno Domini. Like, let's not. They were anti-Christian, so we don't want to be tethered to remind ourselves when Jesus was born. Let's start when the French Revolution was born. This is year zero.
They
year one.
were gonna rename all the months and things like that too, and it just didn't take.
And I think the English just hate the French. So, no, they do. So just out of sheer spite, they'll do the opposite. Of
Want to speak to that, James?
No.
Yeah. So,
I wonder if, when you speak of somebody, he or she is all thumbs, what happened there?
I wonder.
No fingers.
James, wasn't the English currency also base 12?
Yeah, 12 shillings in a pound.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Interesting. Well, for example, like even the linguistically, like
12 pennies in a shilling, 20 shillings.
there's a royal rank, a marquis.
Yeah.
English would call it a marquis. Or you have a valet.
Well, the English are really French.
Yeah, the French took
Because
over.
1066,
Exactly. The English would call a valet a valet.
Yeah.
I thought they do this just out of spite. They're like, we'll not talk your French frog. No, well,
Now, the vowels have to be so sharp that they cut.
okay. The French off.
But yeah, it's interesting the way different languages, and we kind of get off on different.
Sure,
things,
it's
but
fun.
Number systems, why are the Chinese so good at mathematics? Although taught English in China, and one reason is because their system of counting is very different. It's much easier. They don't have to deal with these stupid 12s or teens, right?
Yeah.
They go 10 and 1, 10 and 2, 10 and 3, not 10, 11. What the heck?
I hated that
11?
growing up.
12? What's that? Yeah,
They call me 10-1, 10-2,
Yeah.
10-3,
right.
10-4,
Much more sense.
21, 22.
Much
yeah,
more
yeah,
sense.
yeah.
The Germans too, it's 2 and 20. Really?
Yeah.
3 and 20.
Five sons, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is how the presets on radios and stuff often work. You go 1 through 9, and then it's 1 0, then it's 1 1.
Do you know that the keyboard, when you type, it's intentionally, it's not ergonomically good. The problem was there was a keyboard that was very, very good. The problem is when, remember, I'm old enough to remember the clickety clack thing.
Yeah.
Not the ball, but the little hammers. If you type really, really fast, the hammers get jammed. So they have to redo the typewriter to make it ergonomically inefficient.
So they wouldn't change.
Now I knew some geeks at MIT who could hack their computers to reprogram their keyboard with a different order to make, there is a keyboard out there that's been designed by nerd eggheads to realize this is the most ergonomically efficient way to type.
Right.
But it's kind of like the numerical system and the time clocks, we're just stuck with the Babylonians and we're stuck with this is like legacy stuff. That's not really great, but we're just stuck with it. And thus we have English measured like foot and yards and inches, which, yeah, it's just what we got. Driving on the wrong side of the road, these sorts of things. Anyway, time was imprecise for obvious reasons because sunlight varies depending on the time of the year. Of course, it rises at different time every day. Some sets at different times of the year, and often the days were overcast. So how do you know what time it is? So there were alternatives. As I mentioned before, there were water clocks where you sort of have a system where but you design something to pour water into a vessel. We clearly have hourglass, so you know what those are. They have candle clocks, you know, have a big candle, just burns down bit by bit by bit, that's how long time it is. Similarly, in China, they have incense clocks. The long sticks of incense, and you burn it, you know how you burn it, they actually have, they have like, bells hanging on the incense, so once it burned through, they just made a little sound, so it's kind of nice that's something regular. The problem, of course, is that, you know, it requires some maintenance, you know, I mean, you gotta keep flipping the hourglass, you know, and they're gonna break down, and they can be really annoying. I mean, you forget you're not shooting that rock for 30 minutes. I don't know where we are anymore. Some guy takes a nap, or some poor monk just got distracted at the time. Okay, so we have time, it's kind of regulated, but it's really imperfect. Fast forward to the Middle Ages in Christendom. Imagine you're a peasant in a small village or town. No buildings are over 2 stories tall. Most buildings are actually only 1 story tall. But there is one building in the middle of town, which is towering, huge and massive. It's your local church, or if you're lucky, a cathedral. I mean, it just physically dominates the landscape. No matter where you're standing in your local medieval village, you see the cathedral, the church. It's the tallest building in the world, in your world, because people didn't often travel very much. This is your world, and there's one giant God's house that dominates over you. Now, the tallest part of the church is probably the clock tower. At the top of the church is a clock tower, a bell tower. We're not clocks yet. And the bell rang on a regular basis, or regular intervals around certain hours, to some of the monks and the priests, and let them know when they should pray and what they should be praying. Well, again, how did the church know how often to ring when, at what regular intervals to ring the bell? Well, they had counter clocks, they had water clocks, and then sundials, and hourglass. But again, the problem is these are not particularly precise. It required regular maintenance, intervention to keep changing the water, the candle, the hourglass. But it was perfectly functional for their time period. It wasn't broken. The job was to get people to pray at a regular interval. So they know it solves a problem. It just works for what they needed to do. So then that leads us to the invention of the mechanical clock. The very first mechanical clock is actually lost to us. So we don't actually know who made it first, but we do know that it was probably made in Germany around 1360, that around the Renaissance period. These clocks were massive. They didn't have dials or hands yet, that comes later, but they did have striking bells. It was a series of suspended weights and wheels. And the first thing they did with the mechanical clock was put it in the bell tower. And eventually they did have a round clock that we're aware of with the arms and with the minutes and hour hands. But again, who made the mechanical clock? The church. Who commissioned the church? Who would ever have a need for a mechanical clock? No one needs a mechanical clock except the church. It was a holy, sacred church service that was built around the liturgy, the hours of prayer, and it was smack dab in the middle of the church on the very, very top. So again, I want to go back to medieval landscape. You know, I mean, there's really flat stuff, nothing very tall, but there's a really, really tall building. On top of the tall building, there are bells and clocks. And this tells you what time of day it was. So to the extent that anyone thinks about time, you know, as I said before, if you want to know what time of year it is on the calendar, you go to the church. It's like God owns the calendar, quite literally. Now, if you want to know what hour of the day it was, you can't help but look at the church and hear the church. God owns the hours, literally. Time belongs to God. I want to think about the soundscape of your life as someone living in the Middle Ages. From the day you're born to the day you die, every honking day of your life, at every hour or so, you hear the church bells. You can't imagine what life is like without the church bells. It just radiates through your entire existence, knowing that whether even you're not a priest, not a monk, but you know, oh, someone's praying for me right now. Oh, someone is praying to God right now. It's like the threads that weave into the fabric of your existence. It is a certain kind of sacred, unofficial liturgy that lets you know God is there all the time. Even though sound just travels through your world. I mean, in my imagination, that'd be lovely.
I don't know,
Like the Spirit of God travels and fills everything around me.
I don't know how many of you in the room, I'm sure James is aware, Craig's probably aware, you probably were as a kid, but you can hear the bells here in Wayne. You probably hear them too. And it's interesting.
I love that.
That you get it at noon.
Yeah.
I don't know that we get get it at 5 o'clock anymore.
Are these church bells?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
here at Wayne.
Okay, good.
And,
Which church?
this church.
Oh, this church, okay.
This church.
Well, St. Mary's.
St. Mary's has bells.
There you go, yeah.
And then, where I live over in North Wayne, I can also hear the bells at the Valley Forge Military, as well as the cannon on occasion. But, it's something that I never thought of it in terms like you're telling us now, but it's very definitely a part of my memories of being here.
And I
There's
feel like,
the awareness of the church bells.
and if you took it away, you wouldn't notice it unless you felt the absence, I bet, you know?
And then where our family goes in the summer, they also have a local little church, and you only hear the church bell before the church service, and then in the summer evenings, they have a vesper service out on the lake. And they announce that by ringing the church bell to tell you it's time to head to service.
Yeah. And someone to the church.
And in some small towns, the firehouses would, at noon, would, ring the siren.
So we used to get the siren here, right outside the middle school.
And imagine a soundscape where no one had iPods or phones, and no recorded music. Where do you go to hear music? Church! They got a monopoly on music too. Well, the local tavern will have their body songs, but you know, I mean, there's only one place to hear really good stuff.
We grew up in Germany,
Yeah,
exactly what you say, the villages, the high towers,
yeah,
and the bells. For every occasion,
yes.
the bells rang. On Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve,
Mhm.
the whole area,
Yeah.
as far as you could see,
Yeah.
as far as you could hear, the church bells were ringing, all of them, in unison, off key and whatnot, there was some lighter, some heavier. And I think England is part of the UK is the same way.
Much more formal
Yes, of course, British.
But the German clock is running fine.
I grew up in Philadelphia, and it was all ethnic churches.
Yeah.
And so the church bells were not quite in sync.
Oh.
So the Italian church tended to lag just a little bit. I went to the German church. It was-
That's funny.
When Lee and I were traveling in Italy 8 years ago, in a number of places, I have a picture of bell tower and the Venice, but it's a round clock, but it was 24 hours. It only had a single hand, and the one was at where we would normally have the three. And I never asked, never heard why there rather than, straight up like we have, the 12 of that, but.
Well, there was an admiral in the Navy a few years ago. It was a woman who was a mathematician, and she had a clock in her office where the numbers were the opposite. She said, there's no reason why clockwise has to be the way we call it, but so she had her clock going the other way, just to like play with people's minds.
Actually,
So-
time is arbitrary, yeah.
If I may, just for a second, the one thing and Scott, I think you just sort of prompted this. If you look up in the Britannica, it would talk about the ship's bell. We haven't stirred that into the mix yet, but the ship's bell apparently was used as early as the 15th century to sound the time on board a ship by striking each half an hour of the watch, and it would regulate the daily rhythm of life for the sailors. And naval tradition came to regard the ship's bell as the soul of the vessel. So there you go.
But in terms of the mathematics, has anyone's ever been in Prague? If you go into the town square, the celestial clock was put in 1410, and it's still running.
Amazing. They knew how to build them back then.
What's that?
They knew how to build them back
I
then.
had to build them.
But one thing I haven't figured out yet, in southern Germany and Austria and in some places in Switzerland, is that the last sound is the the cuckoo that comes out.
Mm.
Cuckoo,
Yeah.
cuckoo.
Yeah.
Is that the voice of God?
I don't know. I think it's a bird. This really freaks me out. I have a couple friends who went to the Naval Academy and they're on submarines. And they're out for like, what, months
6 months,
at
yeah.
a time and zero sunlight.
Yeah.
And oh my gosh, that's gotta be nutty. So
And
they
they have-
really need clocks.
Well,
The ship fell.
They have a 16-hour day
Yeah.
when they're in the sub.
60.
Is that right?
8 hours waking, 8 hours sleeping, and apparently when they come back to
Yeah.
the real world, it's quite the adjustment to
Yeah.
get back to a 24-hour day.
Their
as opposed
circadian rhythms are off.
To a 16-hour day.
Mm. That's interesting.
Yeah. See, time is somewhat arbitrary. It's like the typewriter. It is what it is, but it doesn't have to be this way. But I do like I mean, I just will repeat myself and dwell on it. I love the idea of the radiation of time, one place high above everyone else, the bells ring, and sound just goes everywhere. You can't escape it. You can't put your finger on it. It just envelops you. And I think that's a lovely image of how God works in the world. You don't always see it, you can't feel it, and yet it's there all the time, omnipresent thing that's constant, reliable. And again, I just want to imagine what it will be like to be a person who was born, raised, and died in a medieval village, where you cannot conceive of a day that goes by without the ringing of the clock. I mean, if you said, can you imagine if there was no clock in the world? They're like, no, I can't talk about it. It will make zero sense to you. And I think the absence of God should make zero sense to us as well.
Another thing we haven't talked about is time as a dimension in relation to the 3 dimensions that we usually live, that we're so aware of living our lives in. And then you put time in there as another dimension and how that can really change things. You think about Einstein and the idea of, someone speeding along at a certain speed and looking at something is looking at something different than the person who's standing still and looking at it. Same amount of time passes, but what they experience is different.
Yeah. It is God who holds our time together. We exist in time and God holds it together for us. Yeah, interesting idea. We're discussing was so fun, but don't we have 8 o'clock usually?
We usually spill over about 10 after.
Okay.
So that you're worried to say.
Yeah, sure. You're right. I have said more last time, but so things get more sinister though. Eventually, so the calendar is owned by the church. No one has any calendar. The church has a monopoly on calendar. They tell you what time of year it was. And yeah, and you need this, right? I mean, no one has an independent calendar beyond the church. And likewise, no one bothers keeping time other than the church. So the church is the owner, the originator of time, calendar, and the hours, and it's a service of the people. And as you say, we exist in time, and you depend on the church for the time in which your daily life. It's a reminder. It's a liturgy, if you will, right? The lowercase l. It's a reminder of who God is in the world.
So when did non-church sources start to have clocks?
I'm gonna get to that. During the 15th and 16th century, clock making flourished. So eventually clocks were made commissioned by the church, for the church, by church people, for church purposes. Eventually, this technology escapes from the church, and the church loses their monopoly on time, and time gets literally secularized. So we don't quite know when, but during the technology for making clocks gets better, more refined, gets miniaturized, and then gets cheaper. So again, during the 15th, 16th century, clock making flourished, particularly in metalworking towns of Nuremberg and Augsburg and Blois, France. Basic table clocks were being manufactured, and the super wealthy, the aristocrats, started having really ornate, beautiful clocks in their homes. So time goes from church into the private castles or manor houses of the super rich. Why did rich people own clocks? I don't know. I don't think they needed clocks to regulate their lives. I think they probably just had them as status symbols. The same reason why you might have a Rolex or a Patek Philippe. I mean, it's just kind of fun to have and show off to your friends. And it is kind of cool, by the way. It's kind of moves on its own. So maybe it's just a toy or a very, very expensive status symbol. And that, so now you have like a box, it's about this big, clocks in the home, within the centerpiece. You bring your friends over to look at it perhaps, and gawk at it. The pocket, so we have time outside of the church into the home of a private rich guy. And then we have time going from a private rich guy around your neck. The pocket watch was invented in 1510 by a guy named Peter Honey, who was a master of locksmiths of Nuremberg. And again, it was a status symbol. Now, these are not the pocket watches, the elegant ones you think of. It was about this big, it was big in box. It's about the size of a shoebox. And you wore it around your neck with a chain. So it's very cumbersome, but we are now making clocks. I mean, the clock that the rich guys had at homes were not exactly portable. I mean, it's just really heavy and clunky. The shoebox around your neck is actually kind of portable. So we see time shrinking. So again, church, private home, on your own body. It's not cluttered. We call it a pocket watch. It's more like a giant neck amulet that is weird. But nonetheless, it's there. It's a big advancement. In the 17th century, this clock around your neck was miniaturized to what we now call a pocket watch. Something about this big that you literally wear in your pocket, around a chain on your waistcoat, in your little pocket. Then they started inventing pockets for your pocket watch. Fashion had to change the company of the pocket watch. But when did we get to the wristwatch? Well, this is actually kind of interesting. During World War II, they started issuing a wristwatch for soldiers. And particularly pilots, because as they're flying around in these airplanes, they actually need to know when to turn around as they're going to crash around the field. So and it's kind of hard to be a soldier, have to check your pocket watch all the time, or a pilot has to do this. So they didn't invent it, but they started issuing wristwatches were odd before. Pocket watches were worn by elegant rich people as a fashion piece, and also what time it was. Regular people, I would like to bring back the pocket watch. I don't want to get one, but regular people didn't wear watches. All these middle class, lower class soldiers were sent to the war, issued wristwatches,
program.
and then they came back.
Of course, it's Thursday.
And like a lot of things in fashion, they kept their they kept their wristwatches because they became they got accustomed to just having them all the time. And thus the watch after World War II became the thing of the proletariat. It got democratized. Every man walks around with a watch on after they came back from World War II. So we go from time being exclusively the church, being totally sacred, to time moving into the private homes of the rich, to time moving into your body for the rich, elegant gentlemen with pocket watches, to now every average Joe, regular dudes, having wristwatches on their hands. So now everyone has a watch. I'll end with this idea, and I'll say more when I get to this next time. But what does that do? I get mad at people when they're late for my meetings for 15 minutes. And I really think a lot about ending on time. I like to show them time, I like to end on time. And I get frustrated with people. I mean, this is my own pet peeve. I gotta get over this, but I don't yell at people, but I do get irritated when they're 8 minutes late. You know, imagine me being a medieval person. Could I be mad at you for being 8 minutes late? No! It didn't exist! It didn't exist! I don't know. I'm thinking, hey, we should meet, around when the sun's around there. Like a 3-hour window. Or maybe, I don't know how people do, but maybe when that church bell rings about 8 times, we'll meet at that fountain. So I'm not saying those things, but I mean, I would be kind of like, God's watching all the time. I mean, like, it's like the God thing's always there. So it'll kind of be kind of holy, you know? I mean, if you have to think about God every time you want to meet someone at a certain time period, it'll be kind of hard to be a bad guy.
So is this something that allowed people to move away from the church a little bit?
Yeah, I think
at least not be as.
Yes, I think this is secularization. Absolutely. So I study secularization. That's my subspecialty. And I used to always study Darwin, Freud, Nietzsche, Feuerbach, and all these secular philosophers. I think I was wrong. They were contributors. I think the real thing that killed God was our watches.
So in the New Testament, they talk about, the third watch or something like that. Any idea how they measured, time then,
Probably the way the Babylonians did it.
Again,
It's a sundial,
Stars.
stars,
Okay.
yeah.
And that part of the world, closer to the equator, it would be more consistent as far as daylight and night than it would be
Good
here.
point, I hadn't thought about that, you're right.
I know
The
when
variation would depend on how far you are from the
Yeah.
equator.
I would go down to Peru, it was interesting because it didn't matter if I was there in January or July, it was pretty much,
Yeah.
the sun would rise and set pretty much the same.
That may be why the British are so messed up.
Only one reason, Jim.
And then you get the Scandinavians.
Oh, gosh.
Well, when I was in Saudi Arabia, you know, we were trying to do business and we would make appointments. But, you know, a scheduled appointment at 3 o'clock or whatever meant nothing. Because I think in that culture, they didn't make time so sacred as we have.
Did you say Scandinavia?
No, Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia.
You know,
I can't remember.
I was in Iran too, and some of the similarities, you would go through the formality of scheduling meetings or whatever, but, they might not happen on time, they might not, it's just, it's like the adherence to scheduled time was not nearly as idolized as it is in our country. And I think about, if you go back far enough, we have tried to make time our instrument.
Yeah.
Whereas you go back to some point in time, like you're talking about, where people didn't have that, they weren't in control of time. We are trying to control time.
You're anticipating the next lecture, but yes, absolutely. No, that's actually the correct point. We think of time as our own.
Yeah.
And if the ancient world, time clear, I mean, it's not just a metaphor. Time belongs to God,
Right.
and you just live in God's world.
Right.
But now we own, I mean, literally, it's on my body.
I think the change came, the God owns the time and we are in that, and now we control time.
Yeah.
Start with Henry VIII. He famously said, when Henry VIII speaks, God listens. And that's when Henry VIII put that clock on this thing, on the chain. He owns time.
So not only did he have
Interesting.
big belly, he had a big head too.
See the Brits.
Well, wait a minute, wasn't he half French or something?
Yeah, there you go. That's the French one. And they did have a pagan enlightenment, French Revolution. So, I think it's in the French DNA. But yeah, like these fashion choices, I think they do affect us. And then these watches we wear, they go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I did this bike ride across Kansas this year, and there was a group of 4 or 5 people that had shirts, cycling jerseys that said Team Slot. And underneath it, it says, we'll get there when we get there.
Well, when I went with several teams to South America and Central America, Honduras and Nicaragua, and a bunch of Americans in the middle of Hispanic country. We used to talk about Hispanic time.
Yeah.
Because they weren't concerned about, whether you started at noon or 12:30.
Right.
It's our time, we are in control, and we're not gonna let ourselves be regimented into a particular.
You said in Italy, the concept is
Fascinating.
2 Italian minutes is anywhere between 2 and 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I'm reading this book about a fellow's journey to a life of prayer, and he talks about going to the monastery and what monastic life is like. And then he gets into a discussion of the liturgy and people arriving at church, and how in the Orthodox Church and people basically in the Orthodox Church, the idea of somebody showing up late for church is a completely different concept. Here, if somebody shows up late and everybody goes, oh, they're late, can you believe it? And he said, when you show up for an Orthodox service, you're supposed to go in and venerate the icons of the saints before you go in to the service. And some people will show up late and, well, should I venerate the icons and embarrass myself that everybody knows I'm late, or should I just kind of sneak in? Well, in the Orthodox Church, the belief is that life should be a life of prayer, always ongoing. So you're not getting there late because it's continuous. So you're just coming in, getting into the cycle when you arrive. So it's better to go ahead and venerate the icons and let people be aware that, you know, people will be aware that you've arrived late, rather than discredit and dishonor the icons and kind of sneak in. You know, when you think about it, there's services that you go to in other churches where people seem to arrive at any time, you know, and here we go, oh, that's not good. And the whole, you know, thought behind it in other cultures is very different.
I had a corporate client who was, you know, a few years before retirement, but he told me that his work life is so regimented by the clock that when he would commute, this was in New Jersey, but his home was in North Carolina, so he would commute back and forth every week. And he said when he went home for the weekend, he would take his watch off, and that his weekend would be by whatever time he feels to do something. He wasn't gonna look at the watch, you know, while I was at home for the weekend, because his life was chained to the clock while he was at work.
Any idea when and who built the idea of time zones?
I do.
Oh, yeah, railroads,
Your railroads, yes.
when they had different
Precisely.
time trains were running into each other.
Yes.
So they had to create time zones to regulate schedules and so
Absolutely. So if you think about it, I mean, this is fascinating to think about. If before the telegraph, clearly for the telephone, the world was quite local. I mean, again, no telegraph, no telephone, mail, Pony Express. The people I do business with are the people I can like yell at, stand on top of a building, they, ah! You know, that's your world, you know, and you might have some trade with neighboring towns, but you slap some bags on a mule and walk across some wooded trails over the Appalachian, and but you don't need time.
Yeah.
You get there when you get there. But when you got like really, really fast travel, time is much more precise now.
And the only thing that mattered was high noon in the West, right?
And
sunset.
well, yeah, and high noon, and every town had a different clock. They weren't synced. Why should they? It just has to be functionally useful.
I have a little story, a funny one. I mean, I remember it because it was so vivid, dovetailing on your idea and people idea on time doesn't exist. Time starts anytime.
Yes.
You're in that cycle. And when I was teaching, I took groups of students in Germany very often, and mostly southern Germany, because we didn't want to show off the industrial Germany, so we went to southern Germany. And my responsibility there was to get the students over there, get them paired up with the parents, and then Julie and I took off and visited our relatives until it was time to pick up the Germans and take them to the airport and see that they could home. But on one of those mornings, we were overnight in a village that you described. There was that big church, and it was Catholic with stark Catholic. I mean, it's 100% Catholic. The southern Germany is mostly Bavaria and so forth. So, Julie, let's attend the church and see how it goes. And it's cold church inside and dark and in stone structure. And we walked in there. There was benches open and walked in there quite up front. And Julie and I sat there. There was nobody else right or left. And then the service had started. And here comes the door opens and 3 ladies came in. Apparently worshiping together every day, frowning. Somebody sat in their seats. We got so bad, we sort of moved over this way a little bit. And speaking of time, they could come in any time and have their own seat, their own rubrics, so to speak, their own worship place even in the church, but the time is important. We didn't know that. You don't know the tradition, you know? It's like in our church, very often I see the same people sitting in the same pews or near there. We do the same thing. It's
People are creatures of habit.
I was just gonna say, but that was so funny. We were, there was a worship service and everything was going on. And obviously everybody around us in the
Knew.
church knew exactly what we had done.
Wait till these ladies get
Yes,
there.
yeah. Wow.
Well, in the history of Wayne Presbyterian, people used to rent their pews.
Right.
Right, so you had your pew, you know, and no one sat in your pew.
Well, that goes back too, when the women were on one side wearing hats, and the men were on the other side took their hats off.
Let's wrap up.
Yeah.
Sure, King. Lord, you are the master of time and space, and your time that you give us is a blessing. It's not what we own, but it's something you give us minute by minute as a kind of grace. And we cherish the time you've given us. And we should be reminded that we do not own time. We do not manage it or save it or hoard it or spend it, but we just receive it graciously from you. And may we be reminded that we are the masters of time, but you are. And you own us and you own the minutes we live in. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Amen.
Thank you.